On the 13th of June 1917, the Western Front trembled under artillery fire, as it had for nearly 3 years. But on this humid morning near Witscheite in Belgium, something happened that the German High Command would spend the next century trying to explain away. A single rifle shot cracked through the dawn mist, and the man they called Der Riese, the giant, collapsed into the muddy trench, his massive frame folding like a marionette with severed strings. The fallen soldier was not just any combatant. This was Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III, heir to a Bavarian military dynasty stretching back to the 30 Years' War, and the most decorated sharpshooter in Kaiser Wilhelm's army. Standing 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders that barely fit through standard doorways, von Roth had become a living legend on both sides of no man's land. British soldiers whispered his name in their dugouts, believing him to be bulletproof, protected by some dark Prussian sorcery or perhaps the favor of their shared god gone mad. The mythology surrounding von Roth had grown with each impossible shot he made. At Verdun in 1916, he had allegedly killed 43 French soldiers in a single day from a concealed position over 1,200 yards distant. During the Somme offensive that same year, British intelligence reports documented his presence across 3 different sectors simultaneously, an impossibility that only enhanced his supernatural reputation. Officers on both sides studied his tactics, but none could replicate his seemingly preternatural ability to anticipate enemy movement and deliver death with mechanical precision. What made von Roth truly terrifying was not merely his marksmanship, but his psychological warfare. He left calling cards, small pieces of paper marked with a black eagle, tucked into the uniforms of his victims when circumstances allowed recovery of the bodies. Allied commanders interpreted this as either supreme arrogance or a warning, perhaps both. The practice earned him the nickname the Black Eagle of Bavaria in German propaganda newspapers, which printed exaggerated accounts of his exploits to boost morale on the home front. According to a detailed account published in the Times of London on July 2, 1917, von Roth's reputation had reached such heights that German command deliberately deployed him to troubled sectors where morale needed bolstering. His mere presence reportedly stiffened German resolve and unnerved Allied troops, making him as valuable as an entire battalion for psychological effect alone. But on that June morning, the Invincible fell. The official German military communique, issued 3 days later, claimed von Roth died heroically leading a bayonet charge against British positions, a noble lie that satisfied the requirements of propaganda, but satisfied no one who knew the truth. The reality proved far more complicated and far more embarrassing to the German military establishment. The shot that killed Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III came from an unexpected direction, fired by an unexpected hand, traveling an impossible distance according to the ballistics experts who would later investigate. Within hours of his death, German officers began collecting witness statements, confiscating personal letters, and issuing stern warnings about discussing the incident. The truth, they quickly realized, could shatter the carefully constructed mythology of German military invincibility at precisely the moment when such myths were all that held their exhausted army together. Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III entered this world on the 24th of December 1892 in the fortress city of Nuremberg, arriving during a snowstorm so fierce that the midwife barely reached his mother's bedside in time. His father, Colonel Johann Georg Ritter von Roth II, took the timing as a divine sign, a warrior born on the eve of Christ's birthday, blessed to bring both salvation and destruction. The von Roth lineage had served German-speaking rulers for nearly 3 centuries, producing an unbroken line of military officers whose portraits lined the walls of the family estate, like a gallery of stern judgment. Young Johann Georg grew up surrounded by these painted ancestors, each one seeming to demand that he exceed their accomplishments, or die trying. His grandfather had fought in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, his great-grandfather at Waterloo in 1815, and further back the bloodline traced to commanders under Frederick the Great. From his earliest memories, Johann Georg stood apart physically. By age 12, he towered over his instructors at the prestigious Bavarian Military Academy, reaching 6 feet tall while his classmates remained awkwardly adolescent. His hands, already massive, could palm a regulation football as easily as other boys held apples. This unusual growth brought both advantages and cruel mockery from envious peers who nicknamed him Der Lange, the Tall One, a moniker he initially despised but eventually wore with fierce pride. His father recognized the boy's potential early and subjected him to a training regimen that would have broken lesser spirits. Each morning before dawn, regardless of weather, young Johann Georg practiced marksmanship in the estate's private shooting range. The colonel believed that shooting was not merely about eye and hand coordination, but about understanding wind, light, temperature, and the mysterious quality he called the breath of fate. That infinitesimal moment when all conditions aligned perfectly for the shot. By age 16, Johann Georg could consistently hit targets at distances that made professional shooters shake their heads in disbelief. His vision tested at 28, far beyond normal human capability, allowing him to detect movement and detail at ranges where others saw only blurred landscape. Combined with his unusual height, which provided superior vantage points, and hands steady as machined steel, he became a shooting prodigy without parallel in Bavaria. He enrolled in the Imperial German Army on his 18th birthday in 1910, entering as a junior officer thanks to his family's aristocratic status. His superiors immediately recognized his exceptional abilities and assigned him to specialized training programs typically reserved for men with years of field experience. Within 2 years, he mastered every rifle in the German arsenal, understanding the quirks and capabilities of each weapon as intimately as a musician knows their instrument. When the Great War erupted in August 1914, Lieutenant von Roth received deployment orders to the Western Front with barely contained eagerness. His father presented him with a custom-manufactured Gewehr 98 rifle, modified to accommodate his unusual proportions and fitted with the finest German optics available. The weapon became an extension of his body, and within weeks of arriving in Belgium, he claimed his first confirmed kills. The transformation from soldier to legend occurred gradually, then suddenly. After the First Battle of Ypres in November 1914, reports began circulating about an impossibly tall German sniper who seemed to shoot with supernatural accuracy. By early 1915, British intelligence had compiled a file on him, though they had not yet identified him by name. French soldiers reported encounters with Le Géant Allemand, the German giant, who appeared and disappeared like smoke, leaving death in his wake. Von Roth's methodology was systematic and patient. Unlike other snipers who took quick shots from fixed positions, he studied his sectors for days, memorizing every trench line, every communication route, every habit of the men opposing him. He understood that soldiers were creatures of routine, and routine bred vulnerability. He waited for the perfect moment, then struck with clinical precision. By the spring of 1916, Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III had transcended normal military categorization and become something more dangerous than a mere sniper. He had become an idea that infected the minds of Allied soldiers like a persistent fever. British Captain Edmund Blackwood, writing in his personal diary later published in 1923, described the phenomenon with haunting clarity. "We fear von Roth, not because of whom he has killed, but because of whom he might kill next. Every man believes himself the target." The German High Command, recognizing the psychological weapon they possessed, deliberately amplified von Roth's reputation through carefully orchestrated propaganda. Newspapers in Berlin, Munich, and Vienna published weekly columns detailing his supposed exploits, often embellishing the truth beyond recognition. In one particularly fanciful account printed in the Münchner Zeitung on March 15, 1916, von Roth allegedly shot a British officer through a periscope, the bullet traveling through the narrow viewing slit to kill the man instantly, a feat technically possible but wildly improbable. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the fact that soldiers on both sides believed them. Von Roth became a useful ghost, blamed for deaths he could not possibly have caused, credited with abilities that defied physics. British and French soldiers began attributing every unexplained sniper death to the German giant, creating a mythology that far exceeded the reality of one man, however skilled. The truth, as documented in German military records accessed by historian Dr. Klaus Zimmermann, in his 1987 study, Myths of the Western Front, was simultaneously more mundane and more impressive. Von Roth did not possess supernatural powers, but he did possess something equally rare: absolute emotional detachment combined with infinite patience. While other snipers grew bored or anxious during long waits, Von Roth could remain motionless for 12 to 16 hours, his breathing controlled, his mind clear, waiting for the single opportunity that would justify the entire day's stillness. His hunting grounds shifted constantly as German lines advanced and retreated along the Western Front. In early 1916, he operated primarily in the Verdun sector, where the French army bled itself white in futile attempts to reclaim fortified positions. Von Roth positioned himself in ruined buildings and shell craters, camouflaged so effectively that French counter-snipers never located him despite desperate efforts. His tally of confirmed kills reached 173 by June of that year, though German propaganda inflated this number to over 300. What separated Von Roth from ordinary snipers was his understanding of human nature. He studied not just terrain and ballistics, but psychology. He knew that soldiers felt safest during routine activities, distributing rations, writing letters, smoking cigarettes during brief respites from bombardment. These moments of relaxation, when men dropped their guard, were when Von Roth struck. He targeted officers during casual conversations, runners between trenches, and occasionally, in calculated acts of terror. Medics tending to wounded knowing such deaths would devastate morale despite violating conventional rules of warfare. British counter-sniper units formed specifically to hunt Von Roth, composed of the finest marksmen the Empire could assemble. They studied his patterns, analyzed the trajectories of his shots, and attempted to predict his positions. Yet he remained elusive, appearing to possess an uncanny ability to sense danger and relocate before traps could close around him. On 2 separate occasions, British snipers believed they had him cornered in specific buildings, only to discover he had slipped away hours earlier, leaving behind only empty cartridge casings arranged in mocking patterns. By January 1917, Von Roth had received promotion to captain and every military decoration Germany could bestow upon him, including the Pour le Mérite, the famed Blue Max, personally presented by Kaiser Wilhelm II during a ceremony in Berlin. Photographs from that event show Von Roth standing awkwardly in dress uniform, towering over the Kaiser, his expression uncomfortable with the pageantry. Those who knew him claimed he preferred the solitude of his sniper positions to the circus of military honors. The sector near Witscheide in Belgian Flanders had become a brutal stalemate by June 1917, with British and German forces locked in a deadly embrace across a landscape transformed into apocalyptic desolation. Constant artillery bombardment had obliterated every structure, every tree, every trace of the farmland that existed before the war. What remained was a moonscape of overlapping craters filled with poisonous water, corpses in various stages of decomposition, and the ever-present stench of death and chemicals that no soldier would ever forget. Captain Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III arrived at this sector on June 8, 1917, assigned to reinforce the German positions as British forces prepared for what intelligence suggested would be a major offensive. The German lines here had grown dangerously thin, stretched by years of attrition warfare and the demands of other fronts. Von Roth's presence was meant to stiffen resolve and inflict maximum casualties on any British advance. He established his primary position in what remained of a farmhouse cellar, approximately 800 yards behind the forward trenches. The location provided excellent sight lines across no man's land and the British forward positions, while offering multiple escape routes should counter-battery fire or infantry assault threaten his position. He worked with methodical care, reinforcing his hide with sandbags and camouflage, creating firing ports that were invisible from more than 50 yards distant. Over the following days, Von Roth settled into his familiar routine. He observed British patterns through his rifle scope, noting the times when soldiers moved between positions, when officers inspected their lines, when supply parties brought forward ammunition and rations. He made detailed sketches in a leather journal, mapping every significant feature of the British trenches, marking targets by priority and difficulty. On the morning of June 13th, Von Roth woke at his customary hour of 4 o'clock in the morning. performing his ritual preparations with the precision of religious ceremony. He cleaned his rifle, checked every mechanism, loaded 7 rounds of specially manufactured ammunition designed for maximum accuracy at extreme range. He ate a cold breakfast of bread and sausage, drank lukewarm coffee from a dented tin cup, and then settled into his firing position to await dawn. The sky lightened gradually, transforming from black to deep blue to the peculiar gray-yellow that characterized mornings on the Western Front. Von Roth controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, entering the meditative state that allowed him to shoot between heartbeats. Through his scope, he watched British soldiers begin their morning routines in the trenches 1,200 yards distant. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, Von Roth identified a target. A British officer moving along a communication trench, identifiable by his uniform and the way subordinates deferred to him. The range was extreme, nearly at the absolute limit of his rifle's accurate capability, but conditions were favorable. The wind was minimal, the air cool and dense, visibility excellent. Von Roth made his calculations instinctively, adjusting for distance, the slight crosswind, the temperature and humidity. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, waiting for the moment when all factors aligned. He exhaled slowly, feeling his heartbeat, and in the space between one pulse and the next, he squeezed. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with familiar force. Through the scope, he watched the British officer stumble and fall, struck in the upper chest. A successful shot at an impressive distance. Von Roth mechanically worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round, his eyes already scanning for additional targets. He never saw the shot that killed him. Witnesses in the German trenches reported hearing a single rifle crack from an unexpected direction, not from the British lines ahead, but from somewhere to the south. Von Roth's head snapped backward, and he collapsed into his hide, dead before his massive body finished falling. The bullet had entered his brain through his left eye, killing him instantly with the same clinical precision he had delivered to so many others. Within minutes of Captain von Roth's death, chaos erupted in the German lines. Officers rushed to the farmhouse cellar, finding the legendary sniper sprawled in an impossible position, his rifle still gripped in his massive hands, blood pooling beneath his shattered skull. Lieutenant Hans Kreischer, Von Roth's spotter and assistant, stared at the scene in shock, unable to comprehend what his eyes reported. "He's gone," Kreischer reportedly whispered, according to testimony later recorded in German military archives. "Der Riese has fallen." Major Friedrich Vogel, the sector commander, arrived within 10 minutes and immediately recognized the catastrophic implications. Von Roth's death itself was damaging enough to German morale, but the circumstances surrounding it threatened to become disastrous. Vogel ordered the position sealed and began a methodical investigation that would consume the rest of that day and challenge everything he understood about battlefield physics. The first mystery was the trajectory. Forensic examination of Von Roth's wound indicated the bullet entered at a sharply downward angle, approximately 30 to 40 degrees from horizontal. This suggested the shooter occupied an elevated position, but every structure within reasonable rifle range had been reduced to rubble by months of artillery bombardment. The tallest remaining object in the sector was a shattered tree trunk, barely 15 feet high, and that stood in the wrong direction to match the wound trajectory. The second mystery was the distance. Working backward from the bullet's angle and Von Roth's position, German officers calculated that the shot must have originated from somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 yards away, a distance that exceeded the effective range of every rifle in standard British military service. Even the specialized sniper rifles used by British marksmen were considered unreliable beyond 1,200 yards. The third and most disturbing mystery was the direction. Based on all physical evidence, the shot had come not from British-held territory, but from a sector held by Australian forces, specifically the 3rd Australian Division, which had recently rotated into positions south of Waichete. This placement seemed almost deliberately calculated to humiliate German command, killed by colonial soldiers rather than proper British regulars. Major Vogel ordered patrols to investigate the suspected firing position, but they found nothing conclusive. No shell casings, no disturbed earth, no evidence that any sniper had occupied that location. The area showed signs of previous fighting, abandoned equipment, filled-in craters, the usual detritus of war, but nothing suggesting recent military activity. British and Australian forces, monitoring German communications through various intelligence methods, quickly learned something significant had occurred, but initially did not understand what. The German wireless traffic showed unusual patterns: urgent messages, demands for information, references to the incident without specifying details. British intelligence officers wondered if they had unknowingly inflicted some tactical victory. The truth emerged gradually through multiple sources. German prisoners captured in later fighting mentioned von Roth's death, though they provided conflicting accounts of how it occurred. Intercepted German letters referenced the tragedy of the 13th with vague, anguished language. Most tellingly, German propaganda newspapers suddenly stopped publishing their regular columns celebrating von Roth's exploits, replacing them with ambiguous statements about his heroic sacrifice without providing specifics. Australian units operating in the relevant sector had no idea they were suspected of the killing. Their war diaries for June 13, 1917, recorded only routine activities: patrols, artillery observation, the usual grinding work of trench warfare. No sniper reported taking an extraordinary shot. No officer claimed credit for killing a high-value target. This absence of boasting struck investigators as peculiar, as soldiers typically celebrated such achievements. The German High Command faced an agonizing decision. They could acknowledge the truth that their greatest sniper had been killed by a single, impossibly difficult shot from an unidentified enemy marksman, which would devastate morale and invite mockery. Alternatively, they could construct a more palatable fiction that preserved von Roth's legend while explaining his death in heroic terms. They chose the latter, issuing the official communiqué claiming he died leading a bayonet charge, though anyone with military experience recognized this as implausible for a sniper of his importance. What Major Vogel's investigation eventually uncovered would be suppressed for decades, hidden in classified files that would not surface until German military archives were opened to historians in the 1980s. The truth proved more extraordinary than either the propaganda fiction or the initial theories suggested, involving not supernatural marksmanship, but a convergence of coincidences so improbable they seemed designed by a malevolent universe. Private William Edward Singleton of the 3rd Australian Division, Australian Imperial Force, had never intended to become a soldier, much less a sniper, and certainly never imagined he would alter the course of military history with a single rifle shot. Born on February 3, 1898, in the remote sheep station country of New South Wales, Australia, he grew up in isolation so complete that his family saw other human beings perhaps twice yearly when supply wagons made their arduous journey to their property. Singleton learned to shoot out of necessity before he learned to read properly. In the Australian outback, firearms served as essential tools for protection against dangerous wildlife, for hunting food, and for the occasional mercy killing of injured livestock. His father, a taciturn man named Robert Singleton, taught his son to treat rifles with the same respect one might accord a dangerous but useful animal, always loaded, always deadly, always demanding complete attention. By age 14, young William could shoot the eye out of a kangaroo at 300 yards using his father's battered Winchester rifle, a skill born from thousands of hours of practice and the peculiar gift of extraordinary eyesight. In the vast emptiness of the outback, where distances measured in days rather than miles, the ability to shoot accurately at extreme range wasn't remarkable. It was survival. When the Great War erupted in Europe during August 1914, the conflict seemed impossibly distant from the sun-scorched plains of New South Wales. But Australian newspapers, weeks out of date by the time they reached remote stations, carried increasingly urgent appeals for men to join the Australian Imperial Force and support the British Empire. Young men throughout Australia responded with enthusiasm, seeing adventure, purpose, and escape from hardscrabble rural lives. Singleton enlisted in Melbourne on April 9, 1915, shortly after turning 17, lying about his age as thousands of other eager recruits did. The recruiting sergeant, faced with quotas to fill and seeing a tall, lean youth who could probably handle the physical demands of military service, asked no difficult questions. Within weeks, Private Singleton found himself aboard a troop ship heading toward Egypt, training camps, and eventually the Western Front. His natural shooting ability caught the attention of his officers during training exercises in Egypt. While other soldiers struggled to hit targets at 200 yards, Singleton consistently scored perfect marks at 400. A veteran sergeant, himself a skilled marksman, tested the young Australian at progressively longer ranges, watching with growing amazement as Singleton continued hitting targets that were barely visible to normal eyesight. "You've got a gift, son," the sergeant reportedly told him, according to Singleton's own account recorded in an oral history interview conducted in 1958. "Don't waste it." The Australian Imperial Force deployed to the Western Front in 1916, and Singleton experienced the industrial horror of modern warfare with the same shocked incomprehension as millions of other young men. The noise, the mud, the constant death, the senseless waste. Nothing in his outback upbringing prepared him for the mechanized slaughter of trench warfare. He watched friends disintegrate under artillery fire, saw men drown in shell craters, witnessed all the grotesque permutations of violent death that characterized the Western Front. Yet he survived, developing the emotional numbness that allowed soldiers to function amid continuous trauma. His superiors assigned him to sniper duties, a role that suited his temperament and skills. Unlike the aggressive camaraderie of infantry units, sniping allowed for solitude, patience, and the kind of individual initiative he had known in the outback. He worked alone, or with a single spotter, hunting German soldiers with the same methodical approach he once used for hunting game. By June 1917, Singleton had accumulated 47 confirmed kills, a respectable but not extraordinary tally. He never boasted about his work, never collected trophies or kept detailed records beyond what military procedure required. To him, sniping was simply another job in a war full of terrible jobs, something to be done competently until he could return home to Australia and try to forget everything he had witnessed. On the morning of June 13, 1917, Private William Singleton occupied a forward observation post in a partially collapsed building approximately 2,000 yards from German lines. His assigned duty that day was artillery spotting, observing German positions and calling back coordinates for Australian artillery batteries to target. It was relatively safe work, requiring patience and good eyesight but rarely exposing him to direct danger. He had no idea that Captain Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III, the most feared German sniper on the Western Front, occupied a position roughly 2,000 yards distant, or that within hours, their lives would intersect in the most permanent way possible. The observation post where Private William Singleton spent that June morning consisted of 3 partially intact walls from what had once been a Belgian farmer's grain storage building, reinforced with sandbags and camouflaged with canvas painted to match the surrounding rubble. A narrow firing slit provided views across a devastated landscape toward German positions, offering excellent sight lines for artillery observation, but requiring Singleton to remain nearly motionless for hours to avoid detection by enemy spotters. Singleton had established a comfortable routine in such positions. He would arrive before dawn, settle in with his rifle, telescope, field telephone, and rations for the day, then spend long hours scanning enemy territory for any activity worth reporting. The work demanded patience but allowed his mind to wander, remembering better times in Australia, imagining the life he would build after the war ended, assuming he survived. On this particular morning, atmospheric conditions created unusual visibility across no man's land. The typical haze of smoke and dust had settled overnight, and the rising sun illuminated the landscape with rare clarity. Through his telescope, Singleton could see farther than normal, distinguishing details in German positions that were typically obscured by poor visibility. At approximately 6:15 in the morning, Singleton noticed movement in what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse cellar far behind German forward trenches. The distance was extreme. He estimated roughly 2,000 yards, but something about the movement pattern suggested deliberate human activity rather than rats or wind-blown debris. He focused his telescope on the location, studying it with the patient attention that characterized his approach to observation. For several minutes he saw nothing definitive. Then, briefly, He caught a glimpse of what might have been a rifle barrel protruding from a carefully camouflaged position. Singleton made a note in his observation log, marking the coordinates for potential artillery targeting, though the range made accurate shelling difficult. Meanwhile, Captain von Roth, 800 yards ahead of Singleton's suspected position, had identified his target in the British trenches and was making his final preparations for the shot. He had no awareness of the Australian observer far behind Allied lines, no sense of the danger converging on him from an unexpected direction. His entire focus concentrated on the British officer moving through the communication trench 1,200 yards distant. At 6:32 in the morning, as later reconstructed from multiple witness accounts, von Roth fired his shot. The British officer fell, struck in the chest. Through his telescope, Singleton observed the commotion in the British trenches as soldiers rushed to aid their fallen commander. He also noted the muzzle flash from the suspected German sniper position, confirming his earlier observation. Singleton made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than simply report the sniper position for artillery targeting, he decided to engage directly. Years later, he struggled to explain this choice, attributing it to instinct, anger at seeing another Allied soldier killed, or perhaps simple professional pride. Whatever the motivation, he picked up his rifle, a standard Lee Enfield Mark III modified with a telescopic sight, and began his calculations. The distance was absurd, roughly 2,000 yards, far beyond the rifle's designed effective range. The angle was awkward, requiring him to shoot at a significant downward trajectory. Wind conditions, though favorable, could still deflect the bullet unpredictably over such a distance. Every aspect of the physics involved argued against attempting the shot. Singleton should have used his field telephone to call in artillery support and let the guns handle the problem. Instead, he adjusted his position, estimated the necessary holdover and windage, and aimed at the location where he believed the German sniper was hidden. He could not see a clear target. The camouflage was too effective, but he could approximate the firing position based on the muzzle flash he had observed. Singleton took 3 deep breaths, steadied himself against the sandbags, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Through his scope, he saw nothing. No indication whether his bullet struck anywhere near the target, no visible effect. The distance was too great to observe bullet impact with certainty. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge, and chambered another round, preparing for a follow-up shot. Before he could fire again, his spotter, Private James McLean, grabbed his shoulder. "Did you hit something?" McLean asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Don't know," Singleton replied. "Too far to see." Both men continued their observation for another 10 minutes, watching for any indication of activity at the suspected German sniper position. They saw nothing unusual, no return fire, no movement, no signs that Singleton's shot had any effect. Eventually, they returned to their routine duties, and Singleton filed his standard observation report, mentioning the suspected sniper position and noting that he had engaged it with rifle fire without observing results. In the immediate aftermath of Captain von Roth's death, Major Friedrich Vogel faced a crisis that transcended mere military tragedy. The psychological impact on German forces threatened to undermine defensive preparations at precisely the moment when British forces appeared ready to launch a major offensive. Soldiers whispered in their trenches, and whispers in wartime had a way of metastasizing into panic. Vogel's investigation of the killing site produced increasingly disturbing findings. The forensic evidence clearly indicated a shot from extreme range at a steep downward angle, suggesting the shooter occupied an elevated position somewhere in or behind Allied lines. But what elevated position could possibly exist in a landscape flattened by 3 years of artillery bombardment? The question haunted him. On June 14, 1917, Vogel filed his preliminary report to Divisional Command, carefully documenting the physical evidence while avoiding speculation about the supernatural implications some soldiers were already suggesting. He noted the trajectory, the estimated range, the absence of any reasonable explanation for how such a shot could have been made. He concluded with a recommendation that the circumstances of von Roth's death be classified and a more acceptable narrative be prepared for public consumption, The German High Command recognized the danger immediately. Von Roth's reputation had been carefully cultivated as a propaganda asset, portraying German military supremacy and martial skill. His death at the hands of an unknown Allied marksman who achieved an impossible shot from an impossible position threatened to invert that narrative, suggesting that German soldiers could be killed by enemies possessing superior abilities. On June 16, 1917, a classified directive emerged from German Supreme Command, stamped with the highest security classification. All documentation related to von Roth's death was to be collected and sealed. Officers and soldiers with knowledge of the true circumstances were interviewed and instructed to maintain absolute silence. The official story, von Roth died heroically leading an infantry assault, was to be the only version acknowledged in any official capacity. Private journals and letters from German soldiers stationed at Wyczetii during June 1917, examined by historians decades later, reveal the difficulty of maintaining this fiction. Men who witnessed the aftermath knew the official story was false, and many recorded their confusion and anger at the obvious lie. Yet military discipline and the threat of severe punishment for spreading defeatist rumors kept most soldiers silent. The British and Australian forces, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the significance of what had occurred. Singleton's observation report, noting that he had fired on a suspected German sniper position from extreme range, passed through routine channels without attracting special attention. Artillery spotters regularly took opportunistic shots at distant targets with uncertain results. Singleton's action seemed unremarkable. This changed on June 18, 1917, when British intelligence intercepted and decoded a German wireless message referencing the incident of the 13th and emphasizing the importance of maintaining security regarding the circumstances of Captain von Roth's death. British intelligence officers, already maintaining a substantial file on von Roth based on 3 years of reports about his activities, immediately recognized the name. Captain Arthur Pemberton of British military intelligence began a methodical investigation, cross-referencing German wireless traffic with British and Australian unit reports from June 13th. He discovered Singleton's observation report, which had been filed but not given particular attention, noting an engagement with a suspected German sniper at approximately 2,000 yards in a location that roughly corresponded to where the Germans seemed to be focusing their security concerns. Pemberton traveled to the Australian sector to interview Singleton personally on June 22, 1917. The meeting, reconstructed from Pemberton's notes held in British military archives, revealed a puzzled Australian private who had no idea his routine shot might have struck someone important, much less killed the most feared German sniper on the Western Front. "I took a shot at a suspected position," Singleton reportedly told Pemberton. "Distance was about 2,000 yards, maybe a bit more. Couldn't observe results. Might have hit something, might have missed by a mile. At that range, it's mostly luck if you hit anything at all." Pemberton asked Singleton to describe the shot in detail, his position, the target location, the atmospheric conditions, his calculations. As Singleton provided these details, Pemberton made careful notes, already forming a hypothesis about what had occurred but reluctant to voice it until he could verify the facts. The following day, Pemberton arranged for a surveying team to precisely measure the distance between Singleton's observation post and the location where German forces had apparently recovered von Roth's body. The measurement confirmed a distance of 2,100 yards, over 1 mile, far beyond the standard effective range of the Lee Enfield rifle Singleton had used. Pemberton faced the same dilemma as his German counterpart, though for different reasons. If Singleton had indeed killed von Roth with that impossible shot, it represented an extraordinary propaganda victory. Colonial Australian soldier kills legendary German sniper with a shot that defied belief. But publicly claiming credit for the killing risked inviting skepticism and mockery if the facts could not be verified absolutely, and verification was impossible given that German forces controlled the death site. Captain Arthur Pemberton's investigation continued through the final weeks of June 1917, accumulating fragments of evidence that slowly assembled into a coherent but almost unbelievable narrative. He interviewed additional Australian soldiers who had been in positions to observe the general area on June 13th, though none could provide direct confirmation of what Singleton's bullet had achieved at extreme range. The most compelling corroborating evidence came from an unexpected source, a German corporal named Otto Brenner, who was captured during a raid on June 28, 1917. During routine interrogation, Brenner mentioned that morale in his unit had collapsed following the death of the great Captain von Roth on June 13. Brenner described rumors circulating among German soldiers about mysterious circumstances surrounding the death, contradicting the official story of heroic sacrifice. Pressed for details, Brenner admitted he knew little beyond rumors, but he mentioned that officers in his unit had confiscated letters and journals, threatened soldiers with punishment for discussing the incident, and generally behaved as though something scandalous had occurred that required suppression. This pattern of behavior suggested German command was desperately hiding something, lending credibility to the theory that von Roth's death had occurred in embarrassing circumstances. Pemberton also examined German propaganda newspapers, noting the abrupt cessation of articles celebrating von Roth's exploits. The final article appeared on June 10, 1917, just 3 days before his death, describing his heroic service with the usual exaggerated language. After June 13th, von Roth's name disappeared from German newspapers for several weeks, then reappeared only in vague obituaries claiming he fell in service to the fatherland, without providing specifics about when or how. By early July 1917, Pemberton had assembled enough evidence to present a preliminary report to British Military Intelligence Command. His conclusion, stated cautiously but firmly, was that Private William Singleton had very likely killed Captain Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III with an extraordinarily difficult rifle shot from a range exceeding 2,000 yards, a feat so improbable that it seemed to defy the laws of ballistics, yet which could not be explained any other way, given the convergence of evidence. British command faced a strategic decision. They could publicize Singleton's achievement, potentially boosting Allied morale while delivering a psychological blow to German forces. However, the extraordinary nature of the shot invited skepticism, and if independent verification proved impossible, the entire story might be dismissed as clumsy propaganda. Furthermore, drawing attention to Singleton would make him a marked man, a target for German revenge if he remained in frontline service. The decision reached on July 8, 1917, represented a compromise that would have lasting historical consequences. British command authorized limited acknowledgement of von Roth's death without specifically claiming credit for killing him. They would allow carefully selected journalists to report that the feared German sniper had been killed, citing unspecified intelligence sources, while keeping Singleton's identity classified and his role officially unacknowledged. This approach achieved the propaganda objective, informing Allied soldiers and home front populations that the legendary German sniper was dead, while protecting Singleton and avoiding the risk of being accused of fabricating an impossible story. It also had the unintended effect of creating a historical mystery that would perplex researchers for decades. On July 12, 1917, several British newspapers published brief articles noting that Captain Johann Georg Ritter von Roth, the feared German sniper known as the Black Eagle of Bavaria, had been killed in action on the Western Front. The articles provided no details about how or where he died, citing only reliable intelligence sources. German newspapers, forced to acknowledge what was becoming common knowledge among soldiers, published similar brief acknowledgments of his death. Private William Singleton, meanwhile, continued his duties as an artillery spotter and occasional sniper, unaware that British command had investigated his shot or that he might have killed anyone of particular importance. His spotter, Private James McLean, had mentioned to a few fellow soldiers that Singleton had taken an incredibly long shot on June 13th, but without any confirmed results, the story generated little interest among men who witnessed extraordinary events daily. The truth about what happened on that June morning emerged gradually through convergent lines of evidence examined by historians long after the war ended. German military archives, slowly opened to researchers beginning in the 1960s, revealed Major Vogel's investigation reports and the subsequent suppression orders. These documents confirmed that von Roth died from a long-range rifle shot, originating from Allied positions, contradicting the official story of death during an infantry assault. British military archives, similarly examined by historians, revealed Pemberton's investigation and his conclusion that Singleton's shot had likely killed von Roth. Cross-referencing German and British documents, along with contemporary witness accounts, allowed researchers to reconstruct the event with reasonable confidence, though absolute certainty remained impossible, given that no one actually observed the bullet strike von Roth. The ballistic analysis, conducted retrospectively by military historians and forensic experts, confirmed the shot's improbability, but not its impossibility. Under ideal conditions, minimal wind, clear visibility, proper elevation adjustment, a skilled marksman could theoretically hit a man-sized target at 2,000 yards with a Lee Enfield rifle. The probability of success was extremely low, perhaps 1% or less, but not zero. Several factors appeared to have aligned in Singleton's favor that morning. First, the atmospheric conditions were unusually favorable, with clear air and minimal wind. Second, his elevated position provided a steep downward angle that somewhat reduced the effective distance the bullet needed to travel accurately. Third, his extraordinary eyesight, honed by years in the Australian outback, allowed him to estimate range and windage better than average soldiers could. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, pure chance placed his bullet in the narrow window where von Roth's head was exposed. Dr. Klaus Zimmermann, whose 1987 study Myths of the Western Front extensively examined von Roth's death, concluded, "Private Singleton made a shot that any competent marksman might attempt under similar circumstances, but which perhaps 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 such attempts would actually strike the target. That his bullet found Captain von Roth's head rather than missing entirely or striking non-vital areas represents the ultimate confluence of skill and fortune, the kind of improbable outcome that occurs rarely but inevitably in warfare, involving millions of soldiers firing billions of rounds." Private William Singleton survived the Great War, returning to Australia in 1919 after 4 years of service that left him physically intact but psychologically scarred, as were most men who experienced the Western Front's industrialized horror. He resumed civilian life in New South Wales, married a local woman named Margaret Hayes in 1921, and worked various jobs: sheep station hand, ranch foreman, eventually a small property owner, while rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. For decades, Singleton remained entirely unaware that he had killed Captain Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III. The classified nature of Pemberton's investigation meant that no official notification ever reached him, and the fragmentary newspaper accounts of von Roth's death in July 1917 made no connection to any specific Allied soldier. Singleton remembered taking an unusually long shot on June 13, 1917, as he remembered hundreds of other incidents from 4 years of war. But he had no reason to believe that particular shot achieved anything significant. This changed in 1958, when an Australian military historian named Dr. Robert Patterson, researching a book about Australian snipers in the Great War, discovered references to Singleton in newly declassified British military archives. Patterson traveled to Singleton's small property in New South Wales to interview the then 60-year-old veteran about his wartime service. The interview, recorded on magnetic tape and preserved in Australian War Memorial Archives, captures Singleton's stunned reaction when Patterson explained the likely outcome of his June 13th shot. After a long silence, Singleton reportedly said, "I fired hundreds of rounds during the war, killed men whose names I'll never know at distances where I could barely see them as human beings. And you're telling me that one shot, taken at impossible range with no expectation of hitting anything, killed the most famous German sniper of the war? That's insane. That's just insane." Patterson's subsequent book, Australian Marksmen of the Great War, published in 1961, included a detailed chapter on Singleton and the von Roth killing, based on declassified British and German military documents. The book attracted modest attention in Australia but remained relatively obscure internationally, overshadowed by the vast literature about World War I that flooded publishers in the early 1960s. Singleton himself gave several newspaper interviews in his later years, always expressing ambivalence about his wartime role, and particularly about the von Roth shooting. "I don't feel proud of it," he told the Sydney Morning Herald in a 1966 interview. I was doing a job that needed doing in a war that shouldn't have been fought. If my bullet killed von Roth, then I suppose I saved some Allied lives that he would have taken. But I also ended a human life. Someone's son, probably someone's brother or husband. War makes us all killers, and there's no glory in that, no matter what the propaganda says. The German perspective on von Roth's death evolved significantly over the decades following the war. During the 1920s and 30s, German military publications maintained the official fiction that he died heroically leading an assault, presenting him as a symbol of martial valor. This narrative served Nazi propaganda purposes in the 1930s, and von Roth was posthumously celebrated as an exemplar of German military excellence. The truth emerged gradually in the post-war period as historians gained access to previously classified German military archives. Major Vogel's investigation reports, discovered in the 1960s, revealed the actual circumstances of von Roth's death and the subsequent cover-up. German historians, now able to examine their nation's military history without political constraints, acknowledged the deception and analyzed why German command felt compelled to hide the truth. The most comprehensive German study of von Roth's life and death appeared in 1987, authored by Dr. Klaus Zimmermann of the University of Munich. Zimmermann's work, based on exhaustive archival research and interviews with surviving veterans who knew von Roth, presented a nuanced portrait of a man whose legend far exceeded his actual accomplishments, impressive though those were. Von Roth was an exceptionally skilled sniper, Zimmermann wrote, but he was also a propaganda creation, amplified by German military command into something superhuman. His death revealed the fragility of such manufactured legends. One bullet from an unknown enemy, fired at impossible range largely by chance, destroyed years of careful myth-making. German command understood that acknowledging this reality would undermine the broader propaganda narrative they had constructed around military invincibility. The ballistic improbability of Singleton's shot has made von Roth's death a subject of continuing fascination among military historians and firearms enthusiasts. Computer simulations conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, using period-accurate rifles and ammunition specifications, confirmed that hitting a human head at 2,000 yards with a Lee Enfield rifle represented an extraordinarily difficult feat, with success probability estimated between 0.5 and 2% under ideal conditions. Some skeptical historians have questioned whether Singleton's bullet actually killed von Roth, suggesting alternative explanations. Perhaps another Allied sniper, positioned closer to von Roth, fired simultaneously and struck him. Perhaps von Roth was killed by a stray artillery fragment, and the trajectory was misinterpreted. Perhaps the entire story represents elaborate fabrication by British intelligence designed to claim credit for von Roth's death. However, the preponderance of evidence, the convergence of German and British archival documents, witness testimonies, ballistic analysis, and the absence of any credible alternative explanation, supports the conclusion that Singleton's shot did indeed kill von Roth. The improbability of the outcome does not negate its reality. Improbable events occur constantly in warfare, where millions of participants create countless opportunities for unlikely coincidences. William Singleton died on August 7, 1973, at age 75. Having lived a quiet life far from the battlefield fame that might have been his, had British command chosen to publicize his achievement. He was buried in a small cemetery in rural New South Wales, his gravestone noting his service in the Australian Imperial Force, but making no mention of von Roth or the impossible shot. Captain Johann Georg Ritter von Roth III was initially buried in a military cemetery near Wichede, then later reinterred in a German war cemetery at Langemark, Belgium, where his grave can be visited today. The stone marker identifies him simply by name, rank, and dates of birth and death with no reference to his reputation or accomplishments, a modest memorial for a man whose legend once terrified Allied soldiers across the Western Front. The story of von Roth and Singleton illustrates warfare's essential randomness, where skill and preparation intersect with chance in ways that often defy prediction or explanation. Von Roth possessed extraordinary abilities, yet he died not in dramatic combat against a worthy opponent but from a single bullet fired by a competent but unremarkable soldier who happened to be looking in the right direction at the right moment With the right conditions, and just enough skill to place his shot within the narrow margin where improbable becomes actual, German command tried to bury the truth because acknowledging it would have demolished their carefully constructed mythology. They succeeded for decades, but ultimately archives preserve what propaganda tries to conceal. The truth emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through patient historical research, cross-referencing documents, interviewing survivors, and reconstructing events from fragmentary evidence. Today, military historians cite von Roth's death as a case study in the fragility of manufactured legends and the role of chance in warfare. No soldier, however skilled, is truly invincible. Every legend, however powerful, can be destroyed by a single bullet from an unexpected direction. And sometimes the most significant moments in history occur not through grand design, but through improbable coincidences that change everything in an instant. One rifle shot, 2,000 yards, a clear morning in Belgian Flanders, and the convergence of two men who never saw each other but whose lives intersected with permanent finality. The German Invincible died to a rifle shot, not because German propaganda was entirely false. Von Roth was genuinely skilled, but because even genuine skill cannot overcome the fundamental randomness of war. The truth they tried to bury was not that von Roth was vulnerable, which every human is, but that his death occurred in circumstances that revealed the hollowness of myth-making. Reality, as it often does, proved more complex and more interesting than the legends constructed to obscure it.